So I'm going to take my cutting instructions and start cutting my fabrics. The first one I'm going to work on is fabric 38, and for my quilt that's this doily pattern in the off-white creamy colour. I've got my label on it here on my right hand side. So the first thing you want to do when you're cutting width of fabric, in other words the fabric as it came off the bolt, so it's like this with a fold at the top and your selvage at the bottom. I'm going to bring the fold down to the selvage and just make sure that they're lined up pretty straight. And what that's going to do is that's going to keep my straight of grain all in order. And then for right-handers, you're going to work on the right-hand side of your fabric. Take your ruler, and I'm going to take a line at the top of the ruler and line it up on my fold at the top here. And on the right hand side I'm just slightly off the edge of the fabric, and that's so that I can now straighten my fabric up so that it's nice and perpendicular to the selvage and this fold. So with your rotary cutter, always be safe. They all have a safety guard on them. So I only take my safety guard off when I'm about to cut, and when I've finished I put it back on again. You want to make sure your fingers are placed firmly on your ruler, and that's why I like these ones, and they've got good grippy bits at the bottom. And then we're just going to put your finger on here and push through. So I'm starting just before the beginning of the fabric, pushing through, and you're just taking off that little wonky bit on the edge there. If you're left-handed, to do the trimming, place the fabric with your side that you want to cut on your left, put the ruler on, line up your ruler at the top here, then take your cutter in your left hand, pull the safety off, go through, push through, and then you've trimmed. So what that's done for us is it's set up a nice straight edge that we can work from. So we're going to now, with this fabric, cut a 2-inch strip. So for right-handed people, you're going to put your trimmed side on your left, and now we're going to put the ruler, and you see this hole number 2 on the white background, we're going to put that on the edge of the fabric, and then hold it firmly with our left hand, push through, and just test that that's cut firmly. If it hasn't cut the first time, just cut it again before you move your ruler. So that's our 2-inch by width of fabric strip. Now we're going to do the same thing, cutting a strip, but this time we're going to cut an 8.5-inch strip. Now to cut an 8.5-inch strip, you may have a ruler that's 8.5 wide. So this ruler would cut your 8.5-inch strip just with the one ruler because it's 8.5 inches wide. But a lot of the time, most people don't have an 8.5-inch ruler. So you can use a square ruler, so like your 12.5-inch square would work. But if you don't have all of those, but you do have 2 rulers, you can do this trick. My ruler here is 6.5 inches wide, so I need an extra 2 inches on top of that. So if I get this other ruler and put the 2-inch line on the edge, and then I get my 6.5-inch ruler and put it next to it, my 2 inches plus my 6.5 makes 8.5. So I'm going to cut that 8.5-inch strip. And there we go. So that's the strips cut for my light background fabric here. And I can see from my diagram that from my 8.5-inch strip, I'm going to cut a background for the swings block, which is 8.5 by 9.5. So I'm going to open my fabric out. And first of all, take this selvage off. So if I put a line from my ruler along the top, I know that that's going to be straight. And I want to make sure I get rid of the whole selvage, not just the fluffy and woven bits, but there's bits with holes in, and I don't want those appearing. So I'm going to make sure I take those off as well. So now I've got a straight edge here. These two are square to that edge. So if I turn my fabric around, I now want a 9.5 inch section here. So I've got my 6.5 ruler, and then this one is actually a 3.5. So if I need to add 3 inches to my 6.5. So I'm going to put my 3 inch mark, 1, 2, 3, that's there. Put my 3 inch mark on there and put my 6.5 ruler on there, and I could cut it like that. And if you've got the 12.5 inch square ruler, you can just put your 9.5 inch line on the left. So there we go, that's my 8.5 by 9.5 piece, and that's for my swings block. So I'm going to fold my fabric up and store it safely so I know where everything is. So sometimes I'll just fold my fabric inside itself. If it gets too small, you could get a bag and put it inside a bag. This strip here, we've got to cut it down to 29 inches. So this is where I'm going to use the mat for my measuring, because this is a rough measurement and we're going to be trimming it later. So I'm going to take my selvage off the right hand side. That's my first move. If you can hear planes in the background, there is an air show on here this weekend, so I've been enjoying having a cup of coffee outside and watching them. Now to get my 29 inch strip, using the mat for cutting, because I often do that for longer pieces, I'm going to put the cut edge on my mat on the 0 line here, and then half of 29, 14.5. So if I take it over here and turn it, I'm going to guesstimate the 14.5 because I know that I'm going to be sewing these strips together and I'm going to be cutting 2 inch sections from them. So the 29 is actually giving me a bit of extra allowance. So when I fold that over there, where this edge of this fabric meets the strip is where I want to cut. So I can put my ruler on just next to where that edge is. Cut there. This piece here I'm going to save because it's going to get used in another block. And this piece is going to be used for my hopscotch block. Now I'm going to take the black, which I've numbered 35. And we're going to do the same thing in terms of cutting a 2 inch strip from our fabric. We don't need the wide strip for this one. So the first thing to do is to trim and then cut our strip, just like we did for the white one. So you're going to trim on the right hand side, flip it over, put your 2 inch line on the left and cut. And if you're left-handed, you put your ruler on here, line it up, trim, flip it over, and then put your 2 inch line on the cut edge and cut there. Our next fabric is the pink for the hopscotch, and that's fabric 36. Now with this one we're going to be cutting 3.5 inch squares, and what I like to do is cut an oversized piece out first. So I'm going to the bottom left of my piece, and I don't have to trim yet. I'm going to slightly oversize this piece. My squares are going to be finished at going to be cut at 3.5. So that's my 3.5 mark there. I'm going to go 1 mark over, or 1/4 over, just so that in case I need to square anything up. And then my squares 3 squares is going to add up to 10.5 inches. So if I cut 10 3/4 to 11, that's going to be plenty. So I can cut up here and across here, and that will give me my piece that I can work with. So here's my piece. I'm going to fold it in half. So I can now trim it down and then I'll get my pieces from it. So I've got my nice cutting line on my left, and then I can put the 3.5 inch line on that cut line. That was nice and smooth because I've only just cut it. That's nice and straight, and this is nice and straight along here. The reason why I folded it is that it just minimises how long my piece is, and so it saves me the more you can minimize that, the better, because then you're not wobbling as you cut. So I know I'm 3.5 inches wide now, so if I open it out, I'm now going to neaten up my side on the right, and I'm going to put this line along the strip just to make sure that my corner is really square. So take my tiny little bit off there, and then take this over to my left hand side and put the 3.5 inch line, and put the 3.5 inch line on that nice cut edge that I've just cut. Hold this firmly, push through and cut. Cut there, and then we need one more square. There. So by just cutting a slightly larger piece out and then subcutting it down, it just makes it, for me, that's a nice easy way to cut those pieces from our fabric. So that's our 3.5 inch squares of fabric 36. The next fabric I'm going to work on is this one. This is fabric 31. So I'm going to cut a 3.5 inch strip from this fabric. To do that, we're going to trim up on the right first, flip it over. I'm going to put the 3.5 inch line on my cut edge. Press down firmly with my left hand, press down firmly with my blade. Okay, that's looking good. And then once we have our full strip, we can first of all cut our squares off for the hopscotch block, and then I'm going to save the rest of this piece for cutting with all of my applique pieces. So from this strip I'm going to cut my 5 squares. Now if you're right-handed, you're going to trim your selvages off on your right side, but I'm going to show you left-handed for a moment. So if you're left-handed, you do your trimming on your left, like that. And then for left-handers, your straight edge goes on your right. And then I'm going to put my 3.5, which I'm going to use the white marking, and that's going to go on the edge of my fabric. So that's 2 squares, because I've got 2 layers. 3.5 on again. 4 squares, and then I'm going to open it out. Five squares. So that's my large squares done. The final fabric that I need to cut a strip from is this one. This is going to be a background for the swings block as well, and I'm going to need 2 pieces from it. It's fabric number 5. So let's just check that our fold is nicely lined up here with the selvage. When you've got a large piece of fabric like this, you don't need to worry about all the rest of it over there. I'm just going to focus on the bit I'm working on. So here's my rough edge here, and I just want to make sure that when I trim, I'm going to get rid of anything that's sticking out over the edge. I think the piece I've got was actually the first off the bolt, so it's pretty wonky. To make sure it's right. So I've got this line here at the top. I can see fabric underneath, so I'm going to trim that all the way through. And then I want an 8.5 inch strip. So if you've got your 12.5 inch ruler, you can put your 8.5 inch line on there and cut your strip. And if you don't have that, when you don't have an 8.5 ruler, we're back to adding rulers again. So just make 1, 2, make sure you've got your 2 inch line on the left. And then add my 6.5. And cut through. So that's my 8.5. I want one of these pieces to be 8.5 by 9.5 and one of them to be 8.5 by 12.5. So let's take the selvage off first. So the first piece is going to be 9.5. And that's going to be putting my 3 inch line. So I've got 1, 2, 3 inches on that ruler, 6.5 inches on this ruler. So that's 9.5. Now my 12.5, it's going to be lovely and easy if you've got the 12.5 inch square. But if you don't have one, we can do this. So my 6.5, I need to add 6 inches. So I can turn my ruler around this way, put my 6 inch line on the edge here, and that way when I add my 6.5 over here, I've got 12.5. I can see that this is nice and square onto there. Cut it on the right. So that's my other background piece for the swings block. Now we're going to cut the applique fabrics ready for the swings block. We already have our 3.5 inch strip here, and that's for fabric 31. So let's do that one first. And because we've cut an end off already, we have a straight edge here. So from this we need one piece that's 2.5 by 3.5 and one that's 3 by 3.5. So for our 2.5 by 3.5 pieces, I'm looking at this little mark here, 2.5. Put that on the edge of the fabric, and I know that this is 3.5 from here to here. So I just need to take that slice off there. And then my second piece needs to be 3 inches. So there are only 2 sizes of pieces for the applique block. And we've got small swings and large swings. So this size is going to become the small swings, and this we're going to use for the large swings. And then for each colour we've got a pair, and they're going to be the same. So if we've cut those 2 pieces for this fabric, we'll be doing the same for this one. So with these, I'm going to actually work from one end, take the selvage off, and then cut a 3.5 inch strip. This ruler is nice and handy because it's 3.5 inches wide. So I've cut this 3.5 inch strip horizontally. I don't want to cut a 3.5 inch strip all the way through the fabric from top to bottom because I'll probably be needing bigger pieces later on. It's just taken off the end. Put that to one side, and then we're going to cut our 2 slices, a 2.5, and a 3. So blue next, and this is one we've got the most pieces of. So I've got 2 small pieces and 1 large piece, and obviously I'm not going to get them from across the width, so let's take the selvage off first. And now I'm going to cut a piece that's a little bit over my 3.5 by a little bit over 8, because 8 is the total amount I need. I've got 2 2.5s, which is 5, and a 3, that makes 8. So if I oversize it just a little, 8 1/4, 8 and 1/8, then that's going to give me a piece that's big enough, and it's also going to leave my fabric over here that I might need later on. So the only thing you have to be careful of when you do this is that when you come to cut pieces on here, you often have a little cut there, so just be careful when you cut more pieces from the fabric. So now I'm going to trim this to exactly 3.5. And then turn it, put that on the edge here. So that's my 3-inch piece, and then I need 2 2.5-inch pieces. There's one. There's 2. So the same for my plainer blue one. This is fabric 10. So now you can work your way through this whole list and cut the pieces that I've said, and I've given you the overall size of slice that you need to cut out of your fabric to get those from.